Well, thank you, Wayne, very much for that introduction and for the invitation and the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. Thank you also for a very pleasant dinner last night and for the very good opportunity to meet socially with so many of you. I've listened to your comments about the failure of the Coalition to meet your objectives in relation to public transport. I listened also last night where there was quite a deal of criticism about the Coalition's support for your industry and the provision of public transport in this country. So I guess this is my opportunity for a right of reply. And so I do want to respond to some of those issues. Let me say that I don't think any governments have spent more on servicing the transport and indeed the public transport sector than has the Coalition at a federal level. For instance, we put in place the funding mechanisms for the infrastructure that you use. AusLink was a program, the first national rail and road transport plan to deal with the issues of moving freight and indeed people around our nation. That program began with the first ever national corridor studies to identify which is the best way, the best mode of transport. They were mode-neutral studies to move people and freight from one place to another. Those studies, which were completed about 2004, are still relevant today and provide vital information which supports investment in road and rail infrastructure. We invented and delivered the Roads to Recovery program, which has meant so much to regional communities. The Strategic Roads program, which provides vital links, federally funded vital links between strategic communities which are not on the national network. So all of those, I think, were very significant contributions. We set up the ARTC, the first time there was a national involvement in management of the national rail track network and development of the rail system. And, in case people have forgotten, we got rid of fuel excise on your vehicles. We lifted the excise that was being paid by urban public transport and indeed by buses across the country at a considerable saving to the sector. And I've got some more things to say about the way in which the Coalition will help your industry in the future and remove some of the impositions which make it so much more difficult for urban public transport and, for that matter, transport to regional communities to be competitive in this country. But before I get to that, I do want to say that it is a pleasure to be back at the Bus Industry Conference and to note the progress that your industry has made over the past year and the issues that you're confronting. As the last speaker before lunch, though, I'm conscious that you would want me to be short and to the point. The mass public transport in Australia has certainly come a long way over the last 150 years. The original horse buses charging passengers a fare of sixpence to travel the length of George Street in the mid-1800s is a long way from where we are today, and let me assure you I wasn't there in those times. But it does strike me that sixpence was probably a fair bit to pay in the 1800s to travel just down one street of a capital city on a horse-drawn bus. So the demonstration is clear. You've become more efficient and more effective in the things that you do, and indeed more cost competitive. There were steam buses in the earlier 20th century, then petrol buses, electric trolley buses, and now today diesel, CNG and natural gas buses. I'm told that there are over 87,000 buses operated by more than 3,000 companies across Australia, employing 50,000 people. So it is also a very significant industry. Over the past decade, patronage of public transport in Australia has grown dramatically, with around 1.5 billion passenger trips per year in the bus and coach industry alone. And that's not to mention the 1.5 million travellers who use long-distance travel, rural tourism, charter and express services each year. With fuel prices continuing to rise our population's increasing urban congestion compounding, there's no doubt that mass transit will play a vital role in our transport task into the future. Effective public transport has the potential to not only improve productivity but also to relieve social stress, and you've heard a little about that from previous speakers. As we all know, urban congestion in our capital cities has been estimated by the Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics to cost the nation $20 billion by 2020. That is a real cost, and a real cost that needs to be addressed. Now, as noted in Wayne's introduction, the federal government has not directly funded public transport, be it passenger rail or buses, but we have provided billions of dollars to help build the road and the street network used by buses and trains. The federal government is also taking a greater interest in transport planning and logistics across the country. Now, this process took a major leap when the Coalition introduced the first National Road and Rail Infrastructure Plan, which began with corridor studies, as I mentioned earlier, to design the best possible way to service our towns and our cities and to develop appropriate transport network. These studies are still useful documents in helping us to plan infrastructure. The potential for public transport to improve productivity is something that the Coalition is keenly aware of, and we're certainly prepared to play a role in helping ensure that the potential that public transport offers to reduce congestion is fully achieved. I welcome your offer to provide ideas and policy proposals that we can take up. We have been inviting public submissions to deal with policy development processes now for more than a year, and so any additional contributions that your industry and your association is prepared to make would be warmly welcome. It is, however, the case that individual state and territory governments are and should be responsible and accountable for the operation of public transport networks in their states, and Wayne acknowledged that in his opening remarks. There's no way that a bureaucracy in Canberra could or should manage and operate these services that require a great deal of local knowledge and input and vary considerably according to local demand. I guess things like the Pink Bats program are clear examples that the federal government is not an expert in local service delivery. We have thousands of public servants in a health department but no hospital. We've got thousands in an education department but no schools. So I don't think we want hundreds in federal transport departments without any buses. The reality is, when the Commonwealth takes over funding for a service or a subsidy program from the states, it doesn't usually result in more money being made available for that service. The states simply use the money for something else, and there's just been a transfer of funding responsibility, and no one ends up being any better off. So what is important is that there is a clear national direction, that we know where we're going, but recognise that some tiers of government are better able to deliver services than others, and that we need to work cooperatively together to achieve the very best possible results. And certainly, local services are better managed and better provided at a local level. However, it is clear that policy decisions taken by the federal government can have significant impacts on the viability of public transport services, both positive and negative. I think the carbon tax is one topical example of this. As you would no doubt be aware, from the 1st of July 2014, buses will be directly subjected to the carbon tax through changes to the fuel tax credit scheme. This impost has been estimated to add $40 million to the cost of running bus networks in the first year alone. Now, this insidious tax will increase fuel costs for buses, but won't affect private cars. Ironically, a tax that's supposed to be designed to help the environment and take cars off the road imposes a penalty for catching a bus or, for that matter, a train. Yesterday, the Minister Albanese lamented that 8 out of 10 commuting trips in Australia today are still undertaken by a car. And he went on to say, Australia lags behind most other OECD countries when it comes to embracing alternatives to the car. Well, I think that takes a bit of a special audacity to feign concern at a function like this and with this audience, when his government is actually reinforcing the undesirable impact that Mr Albanese is bemoaning. The carbon tax will, and already is, making your industry less competitive. On top of your fuel price rises, increasing electricity costs, mostly as a result of carbon tax, are adding to the cost of your inputs. It affects the cost of running electric vehicles, including buses. It has an impact on the Australian manufacturing sector, including making buses. It's going to be much more difficult to compete with manufacturing buses in Australia with products imported from Brazil or China that don't have a carbon tax and probably will never have a carbon tax. We are placing a penalty on our own industry, our own manufacturing industry, by imposing a tax that's not being imposed in other parts of the world. So if the government wants to take the lead from other OECD countries, the first thing they can do is get rid of the carbon tax and take away this burden on Australian industry, Australian transport that doesn't exist in other OECD countries. Studies are showing us that the uptake in public transport is linked to external variables like fuel prices. So any increase in fuel costs for bus operators, particularly if there isn't a commensurate increase that affects private cars, is a serious concern. It's actually more than that, it's quite bizarre. When announcing the carbon tax package, the Prime Minister lauded the fact that the overall emissions reduction under the scheme were the equivalent of taking 45 million cars off the road. Well, we don't have anything like 45 million cars in Australia, so obviously she didn't intend to actually take any cars or deliver results that had anything to do with cars. However, you look at what the carbon tax actually does. It increases the cost of public transport and it doesn't affect the family car. Despite mass public transport having the potential to provide substantial environmental benefits for the community, the government has imposed this new environmental tax on industry. On top of that, the cost of building buses and coaches in Australia, as I've already mentioned, will increase, and that's going to make our manufacturing industry less competitive. That manufacturing strength employs 10,000 Australians at the present time, so it is not an insignificant Australian employer. Increased electricity costs and transport costs added to the impact of the Australian dollar, which is now anchored well above parity, will have a significant long-term effect on the ability of local manufacturers to be competitive. Let me assure you, the Coalition is committed to abolishing the carbon tax immediately on return to government, and that means abolishing the impact which is set to apply to your industry directly in 2014, taking away the significant increases which have delivered to electricity prices, which has delivered a 15.3% increase in electricity costs in the September quarter, the highest quarter increase ever recorded in Australia. Now, there's one other area where I think the federal government can play a significant role. The National Heavy Vehicle Regulator can provide a lead in helping to do something about reducing red tape and harmonising the many conflicting and contradictory regulations that exist across the country. Mounting red tape is a major cost for Australian businesses across the board in terms of time and money, and certainly affects our international competitiveness. When the current government was elected in 2007, they made a promise that for every new regulation that they introduced, they would abolish one, a one-in, one-out policy. Well, I'm sure they had good intentions, but what's actually happened since 2007 is that we have over 16,000 new regulations, but less than 100 have been abolished. The reality is the red tape war just gets bigger and stronger and more invasive, particularly for small business. As you would be aware, The National Heavy Vehicle Regulator was due to come into effect from the 1st of January next year, but it's recently been announced that it won't be up and running as a comprehensive national system until July. The first bill enacting the national regulator passed through the Queensland Parliament recently, and I understand the second bill will follow in the coming months. Over the years, state governments have failed to respond to industry needs for improved efficiencies by implementing nationally consistent transport regulations, often in spite of signing COAG agreements to do so. The Coalition, like the Bus Industry Confederation, has been generally supportive of the introduction of the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. Harmonisation and less red tape has been a coalition goal for many years. Indeed, one of the commitments we will be taking to the next federal election is to reduce the impact of red tape on small business by at least $1 billion a year. We believe business can work better if we can relieve it of some of the burden of red tape, and that's a commitment that we will be determined to implement on election. With much of the focus on the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator being centred around more efficient movement of freight across state borders, it also has the potential to provide a platform for cutting red tape and improving regulation in the bus industry. Clearly, the bus and coast industry is distinctly different from the heavy vehicle freight industry. Many businesses operate solely within the confines of one state or territory or even a city, and as such don't have some of the cross-border regulatory challenges that other sectors of the transport industry deal with. But I understand that fatigue management laws and access to the road network are two areas that the Bus Industry Confederation will be seeking to advance through the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, and I'd be keen to hear your feedback also on those issues. From a federal perspective, what we need is a return to an environment where there is less government regulation and less compliance burdens. We want lower taxes, but at the very same time, when pressures from overseas competition have become intense and unrelenting, we must make sure that our business environment is competitive. The current negotiations around road pricing can also have a significant impact on Australia's bus and coast industry and public transport more generally. I understand that there are significant differences remaining between the positions of the state and the territory governments and the federal government and local government on the small and large heavy vehicle operators as to the appropriate means of determining cost recovery from the industry. In April 2007, the former government initiated the Council of Australian Governments Road Reform Plan to review current heavy vehicle charges and to look at alternative pricing models that would better reflect industry realities. This process has recently been renamed the Heavy Vehicle Charging and Investment Reform, but I understand that some people are already calling it HAVOC for short. The Coalition will have more to say about road pricing following the release of the Regulatory Impact Statement, which is expected to be released in the middle of next year, and will weigh up the cost of each of the proposals being considered, as well as the role that new technology might play in its implementation. Rest assured, we will not make changes to road pricing arrangements without thorough and broad industry consultation. Twice we have moved to disallow road user charge increases, once successfully, when it was clear that the government had acted without proper consultation and with irregular justification. And we are prepared, in opposition, to keep the government to account on this important issue, and in government work with the states and your industry to achieve a fair and balanced and reasonable and justifiable approach to road pricing. Now finally, I want to talk a little bit about infrastructure investment and particularly investment on roads. Over the past few months, the Coalition has committed funding to a number of major infrastructure projects across the country. In our three largest capital cities, we have committed to $1.5 billion towards building the East-West Link in Melbourne, $1.5 billion for the M4 East in Sydney, which will form part of the West Connects project, and $1 billion to build the next stage of the Gateway motorway upgrade in Brisbane. Additionally, the Coalition announced our plan to fully fund the duplication of the Pacific Highway all the way to the Queensland border as soon as possible. We want to end the political games about funding splits and get the duplication done once and for all. We've also committed to the Gateway Western Australia project in Perth, the Toowoomba Second Range crossing and the Midland Highway duplication in Tasmania. And we'll have much more to say about other projects, including the Bruce Highway, as the months proceed. On a broader level, it's very concerning that the government is now demanding 50-50 funding for future national road projects across the country. This demand threatens to stall all new road projects across the nation, because the government must know that the states don't have the additional funds to increase their contribution to 50-50. It's a cynical tactic, I fear, from the government to betray the principles that have been set out in the AusLink White Paper when current arrangements were first established. There's a long list of precedents of previous agreements showing that roads funding on the National Highway Network has been at an 80-20 funding split. The 50-50 ultimatum from the federal government looks like an attempt to blame the states as the Commonwealth moves to decrease infrastructure spending to try and balance its beleaguered budget. Now, much-needed projects like the Bruce Highway in Queensland, the Pacific Highway in New South Wales, the Western Highway in Victoria, will remain unfunded, and new projects will be in limbo unless this matter can be resolved, because it is simply beyond the scope of the limited budgets that states have and the heavy debt that many of them are carrying for them to be able to match dollar-for-dollar funding on what have traditionally been nationally funded roads. In conclusion, can I once again thank you for the opportunity to address your conference this afternoon. I can assure you that the Coalition acknowledges the vital role that the bus and coach industry plays in our transport network and the increasing importance that your industry will play in reducing congestion and increasing productivity. The industry is important to our manufacturing and tourist industries too, and this contribution should never be underestimated. I appreciate the good working relationship I've had with the Bus Industry Confederation over the years. I thank you for the offer to contribute to our policy-making process, and I look forward to working with you in the future, hopefully at some stage not too far away, maybe even from the government benches. Thank you for listening to me today.